Okay, welcome everybody to our energy use reduction talk by Tony Cowling, part of our Scientists Warning Europe pre-COP Planet in Crisis. And to put us in the picture for the pre-COP, I will read out the chapter on energy from the world's scientists' warning of a climate emergency. The world must quickly implement massive energy efficiency and conservation practices and must replace fossil fuels with low carbon renewables and other cleaner sources of energy if safe for people and the environment. We should leave remaining stocks of fossil fuels in the ground and should carefully pursue effective negative emissions using technologies such as carbon extraction from the source and capture from the air, and especially by enhancing natural systems. Wealthier countries need to support poorer nations in transitioning away from fossil fuels. We must swiftly eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels and use effective and fair policies for steadily escalating carbon prices to restrain their use. I'd like to welcome Tony Cowling here to do the talk on energy use reduction. Tony has a PhD in organic chemistry. Since doing his PhD, he's turned himself into a sustainability consultant, and he also runs a construction company. He's a director of the Reading Hydro Project, and he's also a director of Reading Community Energy Society. So Tony, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ed. That's great. I'm actually been retired from being a scientist or chemist for a long time, and I've also retired from running a building and construction business. And so the picture you can see now is where I hung up my tools. So all my favourite tools, I hung them up on a sculpture which I made and put it on my wall. So I look at it every day with my favourite tools on there. So we just go back and see Reducing Energy Use or Energy Use Reduction by Tony Cowling. We're starting on this. If you do want to ask questions, then do. It's very important to reduce energy use. I think Ed's little summary was really a good one from your strategy document and that very nice paragraph that he had. And I think that waste in all its forms is a bad thing, and oil and gas are running out. I'm not so worried about leaving coal in the ground, but I think oil and gas should remain in the ground, and it's much better to use those things for making pharmaceuticals or insulation, and burning them running about in our cars or keeping our houses warm is a very foolish thing to do with those resources. The real cost of those resources is how much it costs to put them back, not how much it costs to get them out. And I feel that reducing energy use should be our number one priority. Other people have different number one priorities, but there's some very strange uses of energy, and everything has what you could like to call it an energy footprint. And clothes, people waste clothes, and they actually take quite a lot of energy to make them. Transport, especially unnecessary transport, is very energy intensive. And probably maybe the biggest one of all these things that we can do to reduce energy is to actually not waste food. The amount of energy that goes into making food for it to get wasted is alarmingly out of proportion with all the other things that we mention here. Water has a cost, and we have water footprints as well. And I think single-use things are going very out of fashion, although during the recent crisis we've been increasing our use of single-use stuff. So we need to be careful with those, and all those things have got energy footprints involved in them. So we can each do something to reduce energy by saving food, not wasting water, not doing unnecessary journeys. I'm probably going to major on energy to do with homes and houses and buildings, but we'll just have a look. So reducing energy is number one priority. What can we do? The simplest things that we can do are things like draft proofing and air tightness, and the entire existing building stock, very sadly, including new homes, don't really meet any decent standards of air tightness or draft proofness. You may think that you live in a lovely brand new house and it's going to be airtight, and it may possibly be airtight according to an air tightness test, but behind the walls there can easily be wind blowing around, coming out the sockets, behind skirtings and architraves, all sorts of nasty places. And this kind of draft proofing or air sealing is very low hanging fruit, has massive energy savings and exceptional returns on investment. It costs very little to do draft proofing compared with the amount of energy that it saves. And tragically, we've got a very, very long way to go on even the simplest of activities. I wonder how many of you have got a drafty window or front door, or even worse, a draft underneath the windowsill or coming in around some pipes. And then the next kind of most expensive thing we can start doing is to think about insulation. And almost no retrofit floor insulation happens. When you look at diagrams of heat losses from houses 15 and 20 years ago, 15% of the energy used to escape through the floor. Those pictures tend to be the same now, except unfortunately we've insulated the loft. We've sometimes done wall insulation and we've improved the windows and to some extent the air tightness. And so actually more energy goes out through the floor now than there used to. And if I was drawing a slide, I would probably put it as between 20 and 25% of energy is going out through the floor. And if you've got wooden floorboards with gaps and drafts between them, you're probably even bigger than that. And the entire existing building stock needs to be dramatically insulated. That includes loft insulation. I occasionally find a house without any loft insulation at all. 100 millimeters is insufficient. And if you up that to 300 or 400 millimeters, you pay for it relatively quickly in the first couple of years. If you've got none at all, it pays for itself in the first 3 months, which is ludicrous. And unfortunately, somebody in energy poverty probably can't afford to do that sort of thing. I did have a little think about things that could suggest to be implemented in the local plan. And they said to me, what could we do? And I said, how about 3G? And everybody thinks, what's 3G? Well, by 3G, I mean triple glazed windows. And it's actually very easy for us to say, let's not do double glazing anymore, let's do triple glazing. And if that became a level playing field and nobody was allowed to do double glazing, then it would be an easy thing to do. And in fact, in Central and Northern Europe now, if you want to buy a double glazed window because you feel that your house needs triple glazing and the garage would be all right with double glazing, when you go to the window company, they say, I'm really sorry, sir, but it's going to cost you extra to have the double glazed window. Why don't you just put a triple glazed window in your garage or just brick it up and not have a window at all? And that is very remarkable. So triple glazed windows have become the volume product in Central and Northern Europe, and we're still messing about in the UK with double glazing, and the double glazing companies don't like the idea of upgrading their product to triple glazing. But it would be a good thing. Windows lose a much larger proportion of the energy than walls, so it's a lot going out through. Triple glazed windows tend to be more robust. They've got much better ironmongery and they last longer, so they're good. They reduce the heat loss. They're also very good for air tightness, often having 3 or even 4 levels of draft seals. And the noise reduction from outside is really good as well. So that's another one. And
Tony, if you didn't want to overuse resources and you have double glazing throughout your home, is there a way you can bring in extra glazing without replacing your windows?
Yes, you can have secondary glazing. You can have films on the windows. They're not terribly good, the films. I think the point about replacement windows is that if you're replacing the window anyway, then you should replace it with triple glazing. If you're reglazing the windows, you can sometimes use triple glazed units instead of the double glazed units you've already got, and therefore save the window frame. And likewise, if you've got single glazed windows, you can very often, it's not necessarily easy, but it's usually possible, change to double glazed units, even something called slim line or slim light, very thin double glazed units that will fit in, for example, an old Victorian sash window can be reglazed with double glazed units. You have to change the weights or the spiral balances to compensate, but it can be done, and nearly all wooden windows can accept, certainly if they're single glazed, they'll accept double glazed, and they will probably also accept triple glazed, potentially a stepped unit, which is not so good because you can see the sealer bar around the edge. So yes, thank you for that one. So next thing is development, and there's lots of things to do with development. I think next week Ethical Reading are doing some things on development, building type development. And I think that we shouldn't allow conservatories anymore. This would be a very good thing to write into the local plan, because they tend to become part of people's houses, and worse than that, they tend to become part of the heated envelope, and they use an awful lot of heat, or in my view, they waste an awful lot of heat. And even some people have got air conditioning or air cooling units in them to cool them in the summer because they're too hot. And so I think there's a very good policy potentially to tax conservatories, because they are bad for energy use. They actually increase energy use both in the summer and the winter. And so we didn't really want them in the first place. They used to be free of planning permission. Quite often now you do need permission to get them, but I think they should be not allowed. If you want to build an extra room, then it should be a proper extra room, well insulated with good U values. And the other thing, I've tried to get this one written into the local plan, no more dormer windows. A dormer window, typically the side of a dormer window is 100 millimeters thick, and that limits the amount of insulation value you can have in there. And in my view, it should be 300 millimeters thick and have an overall U value of less than 0.1. Otherwise, it's just losing heat too much. And you can even put those on new extensions or new homes. So those were two things that I'd like to put into the local plan and local planning thing. So sometimes we worry about the existing housing stock. I've already alluded to the fact that it needs radical upgrades. And one of the ways to upgrade the existing housing stock is to go for street scale refurbishment of homes. And there's an awful lot of synergy involved in this. And you get a lot of economies of scale if you're re-insulating the outside of a row of houses. It's much cheaper than re-insulating one at a time. Possibly savings could even approach 50%, which is a very substantial saving. Local authorities and other large organisations could take the lead on this sort of thing. It's not really something that I could do and say to my neighbours, shall we insulate the front of our houses and would you like to join with me? You get one or two people doing it and then you lose that synergy and the opportunity.
Tony, can I just interrupt you there in saying that
Sure.
there's much cost and synergy in having streetwise insulation programs.
Yes.
Can you just repeat? Could you just repeat again how much you could gain in terms of efficiency by doing a street rather than individual houses?
In terms of the economics of doing it, it's potentially you could get down to half price for external wall insulation, for re-insulating the roof, because you haven't got to join up, and you can go and do a whole row of houses. You need effectively one set of scaffolding. Probably you'd have 5 sets and move it down the street, but it becomes very economic for a contractor to come in, and he knows he's going to do a whole street of external wall insulation, which is one of my favourite sports. I think everybody should do it. And then re-roofing, each time you do a single roof on a terraced house, you've got 2 abutments to next door. And it costs almost as much to do that joining up as it does to do the whole of the rest of the roof. And so when you do a whole street, it becomes very easy to re-roof. Re-roofing is not always necessary, but it doesn't half make it a lot easier to do proper insulation if you re-roof. And even when I'm talking about re-roofing, I'm probably talking about putting in 200 millimeters of insulation in the roof, or 300 millimeters, and then new roofing. So you're actually raising the level of the roof, which again is a planning thing. There's a company called Energy Sprong, which comes from Europe, and they will come and they will measure your house and they will bring you effectively a new external of your house. So you will have wall panels that are almost the size of the front of the house, possibly 2 pieces or 4 pieces, depending how big your house is, with window frames already in it, without the sashes and the glass. And it's made out of something akin to a structural insulated panel with 200 millimeters of polystyrene insulation already inbuilt, and they exactly fit the outside of the house. They remove your existing windows. You've got new windows. you have a new roof of a similar style, probably traditionally tiled. And I think those, for a terraced house, it can be 35 to 50,000 to do that. But you're getting all new fenestration, you're getting a new roof, you're getting new insulation, and you're getting effectively a passive house levels of insulation and very, very low energy use, like typically no need for a heating system. So that's quite an interesting way. I think they're doing some of those large scale projects in London and various different local authorities around the country. I quite like them where they do effectively street scale renovation, but it's politically it's quite difficult, but I think we need to do it going forwards. And it's also planning, like I've talked about raising the roof, I've talked about external wall insulation. Those two things are planning issues, and so they're effectively blocked before we start.
Yeah, very interesting.
So regulation, there's a regulation in the building regulations which is called Part L1B, and this says that if you do more than 25% of an element of a building, in other words, if you do more than a quarter of a wall, then you should do it to current building regulations, unless you can agree with the local building inspector that you don't need to do it because of some reason, it's a listed building or you can't afford to do it. But this law, basically nobody knows about it. Every time a house is re-roofed, the loft insulation should be upgraded to modern standards. Every time a property is re-rendered, it should be externally wall insulated, and not just replace the render, but replace with render and insulation. And there's almost no enforcement of this, and it's almost never adhered to. If you ask a roofer, do I have to insulate my loft when you re-roof my house? He will say no, because he doesn't know that he has to, or that it should be done. And it's quite worrying, or probably all this stuff drives through to say this is helping with climate change, but none of it's actually happening. It's in the regulations, it's in the law, it's supposed to happen, but it never does happen. It sort of worries me that it never happens, but I think in Reading I know of one instance of a roofer being stopped and told you've got to insulate that roof, and that's in like probably 25 years of being interested in that. And then the next thing that I've got on regulations, I think that we should set national targets for U values across the board for extensions and renovations, so that we know somebody should insulate their wall from what it is now, which is probably quite high for a terraced house, like maybe 2. A good wall would be 0.1 for a U value, and probably for refurbishment, I would be happy with something like 1.5. Other people might be happy with 0.2. Even current building regulations have degraded since the Code for Sustainable Homes went out, and we're actually working to a less tight standard now than we ought to be, and that we used to when Code for Sustainable Homes was in. So there's really nobody knows what the target U values of anything are. I have my own targets, but most people don't even have them. So if you ever do a renovation, come and ask me what should my target be.
Can you just explain U values again?
A U value is a way of measuring how well insulated a wall, a floor, a ceiling or a window is. And they normally come into regulations, and you have to achieve a certain U value for a new house that you're proposing to build. Sometimes you can mess about with extensions and have slightly less well insulated extension because you're arguing that it's better insulated than the house. But basically there are limiting U values that you should be achieving when you design something. But all of these design U values for me are nothing like as stringent or as low energy as they ought to be. I can tell you, for me, a U value of anything that we're doing for new should be 0.1 for a wall or a ceiling. Floor could be slightly higher, like 0.15. And the best window you'll find is something called 0.7, which is triple glazed, krypton filled. Most windows are above 2 or 3 or something like that. Really quite a lot of energy goes out through windows. And if you spend money on insulation, then you don't need to spend money on heating going forwards. I don't really like to tell you this, but in my house, which I built 10 years ago, I don't have a heating system. I just spent money on insulation, and I live sitting happy and pretty without a heating system. No heating bills, no heating replacement costs, no maintenance costs, no servicing costs, and no energy costs to go into it. I just live in an insulated envelope. I don't really want to go too far down that route because I can go on about that for a long time. I think I'll just go on and talk a little bit about the planning. And planning have a crucial part to play in our long-term energy future. Only very few local authorities have made any progress in terms of requirements for new homes. And there's huge problems to solve with the existing stock. And it's a really, really difficult problem. I'm really pleased with Reading. They've just given planning permission for a redevelopment, a refurbishment of existing flats and building new social housing units down Coley Way, where they're going for effectively passive house ideas and notions, so very low energy use, very well built, very well refurbished. And that with passive house, they do a pre-construction assessment, a during construction checks and balances to make sure it's being done right. And very interestingly, they do post-construction assessments. And so you've got really a lot of confidence that the building is going to be built to a very good low energy standard. And actually the output is that the buildings themselves are better built and less faults, less defects, less problems. They've done some in Exeter. Exeter City Council said, let's build our new social housing to passive house standard. And everybody laughed at them and said, it's going to cost you more. And they said, we want to do it and we've got a budget and we're going to do it. And yes, the first block of social housing in Exeter City cost 10% more than it would have cost to build to current building regulations. And in the process, they set up something called a passive house procurement framework, which is the sort of thing local authorities do. The second block of passive houses they built in Exeter cost the same as it would have cost to build them to building regulation standards. And so the people that are living in those are effectively living in Rolls Royces rather than living in a Mini Countryman or a van. So, and they're loving it. Everybody wants to live in these nice social houses that are well built, no condensation, no damp, and almost no energy bills. And I think that's the way to go in the future. And so I think that the planning will need to accommodate the improvements that are necessary for us to do the future. I think we're going to move on to renewable energy now. I'm still well within my time, so if you want to ask questions, please do. And so if you want to think about renewable energy, mostly when we talk about it, we think about investment in renewable energy. And as I said at the beginning, I'm a director of Reading Community Energy Society, RCES, and we offered free solar panels to every school, charity, church and council building, community building in Reading 5 years ago. And we offered our investors a return of 5% on their investment. And we offered the host buildings a fixed rate for their electricity for the next 20 years of 8p per kilowatt hour fixed. It's an unbelievable deal. We only got about 15 people want to take it up. They didn't pay any money for anything. We paid everything. They now pay 8p for the electricity generated through the sun for their own building. And that's a fixed cost. And that looks pretty good now. In another 15 years' time, it's going to look unbelievable. And they're going to say, how did they ever do that? And we're paying our investors a 5% return on investment. And I invested, I've just got 20% of my investment back. And my last interest payment was well over 5%. I don't really want to say how much well over. And you could invest in Reading Hydro. Sorry, you're too late for that. The investment's full and we're going ahead. You could invest on your own solar. You could put solar panels on your own roof and you would really struggle to get between 2 and 4% return on your investment. You would not get your capital back. It doesn't seem to go into the value of the house, although I would like to think it did. So if you go to Solar Streets, it's kind of a little advertisement spot now. They will do group purchases for solar panels for homes in basically pretty much any town in the south of England. And they will come and put solar panels on your roof, 4 kilowatts set up, £4,000. You pay the money and you get the return. And that actually works out as a higher return than the possible 2 to 4%. If you went to somebody local, they would probably want £6,000 for that same system. So I've got high hopes for Solar Streets, and that scheme is economic, has a nice return on investment, especially with interest rates so low. So I still probably advise investing your money. If you want to invest for renewable energy, it's a very good 4.5% is a very good return when
you just
bank
gone? You've
base
just
rate
fucking hit.
virtually zero. Wasting energy. I have a big problem with people who've got windows open, or at least I used to before coronavirus. Windows open and the heating on is such an awful thing to do. Why are you paying for a warm radiator and then open the window? And there's a bit of a conflict now with coronavirus. It's actually better to have the windows open, otherwise you might catch it. Ventilation is incredibly important for coronavirus. I'm not getting it. I'd like to see a lighting directive which says something about lights left on at night. Please don't leave all the lights in your office block on all night for whatever reason. If you think it's security, if you think it's advertising, it's waste, and we don't want to do it. And overly bright lights, there's far too many lighting in shops that I would consider to be overly bright. It almost hurts your eyes to look at them. And so we call this dimming. You can dim it down, use less energy. And then another thing that winds me up alarmingly is lights left on during the day, especially outdoor lights. Why do we need outdoor lights on during the day? And a lighting directive would be really good. I'll tell you the story about New York, where if a shop leaves its doors open in the winter, a parking warden can come along and give them a $100 fine for doing so. And if he catches them a second time, the fine is $1,000. And so nobody in New York leaves their shop's doors open in the winter. And I think that's a really good thing. I've written to Reading and said, please, can we do it in Reading? And they said, sorry, we're not prepared to take it on, which is slightly sad. So summing up, I think that we should all head for a low energy future, reducing energy use. And this should be #1 priority. Don't waste energy. Using what we must use as efficiently as possible. And I have a little bit of a problem with your thing that says use it more efficiently. There's a very subtle difference between using energy as efficiently as possible and using energy more efficiently. You can use a lot more energy more efficiently and you still use more energy. If you use what you need as efficiently as possible, use less energy. So it's kind of me playing a little bit with words, but I feel it's really important to be as efficient as possible and not necessarily more efficient. Heat pumps can be 600% efficient if it's a water source heat pump, but you could still finish up using more energy than you used to use before. If you turn it up warmer, if you just use it on more often and on higher temperatures. And we should increase the amount of renewables generation that we have. So I love doing renewables. I don't know whether we want to stop now or whether I've got one more slide that I can do after this about thermostats, but I think we could probably have a stop and see if you want to ask.
If you've got one more slide, please go ahead. We've got a number of questions in the chat. We can go through them all at the end.
Plenty of time then. If you want to look at stuff, then you can look at readinguk.org/draftbusters. There's a lot of useful information in there about how to draft proof your home. Some of the things that I worry about are internal soil and vent pipes in a casing, linked to the loft, linked under your bath, and possibly linked to the utility room or under the kitchen sink, and cold air can blow down it. You can find all that sort of stuff, how to do windows, doors, holes in the thing, and there's some more interesting stuff in there as well. And then my own house that I built, you can find that at Tony's house, .readinguk.org. And then I'll just do a little bit about thermostats. I think thermostats for me are a thing of the past, so I call them 20th century. We're now in the 21st century. And so if you've got a thermostat, I think you should seriously think about changing it for a programmable room thermostat, or something like a Hive or a Nest or an app-based thermostatic control or management system for your heating if you've got heating. I don't need one of these things, so I haven't got heating, but if you have, then programmable room thermostat can wake you up in the morning with your house at 18 degrees centigrade instead of 21, which you might have on the thermostat at the moment. And in so doing, you save 30% of your heating bill during that period. So it's well worth thinking about doing. And then during the day, you can program the house to be cooler if you're not in. When you come in the evening, if you're rushing about, I don't know what you're doing, like active, then 18 is fine. When you sit down in the evening, yes, by all means, go for 22. And then overnight, I quite like it if people set it down to 14 or 15 so that if it's very cold at night, it does come back on again. And that's kind of a lifestyle thing. It does use more energy, but comfort is one of the important things. And then if you want to sit with me and have dreams and aspirations, dream about life without heating, that would be a very big energy saving move. So I think thanks very much for listening. I hope I haven't told too many stories. I've tried to stick to the point, and I'm sure you've got questions and I'll try and answer them now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tony. If you're possibly unscreen sharing, we've got a number of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Obviously, Tony's happy for people to shout out their questions as well.
Yeah.
So please go ahead if you'd like to. I'd just like to start with a personal question actually on various things we bring into our home where manufacturers ask us to keep them on continuously 24 hours. Two examples. One is, although efficient in one way, my printer wants itself kept on 24 hours and connected to the internet because I get automatic new orders of printing ink. The good bit is, of course, it stops me ordering too much ink and have it all sitting around, and it only sends me what I need. And it is brilliant, but it requires me to keep the printer on all the time connected to the internet.
Well,
the second one is the internet company I'm using. I'm sure it's the same with others, and I'm interested in people's experience actually now we're chatting, is PlusNet. When we were looking at trying to get the highest speeds, we rang them up and asked about it. And being environmentally conscious, I turn off every single plug and light and pilot light, whatever it is in my house, every single night using the internet. And they said one of the reasons your speed is not working is because as they're testing the speeds down the line, they find your internet is off, they think there's a problem with it, and they downgrade it to a lower speed. So they ask us to keep it on overnight. Now I don't, and I put up the lower speed, but it's one of those. Have you come across any other instances of that, and any legislation ideas or anything else related to it?
No, I really hate things that are left on all the time. Like I've got no problem turning my printer off. I've got that similar ink thing. I just turn it off when I want to turn it off and turn it on. It stays off for all weekend if we're not printing. I had a friend who used to go around all of his appliances and he cut the LED glow thing out of it, glow plugs, whatever they are, just snipped them with pliers, take it apart, find it, snip it. Does reduce energy use quite a lot. And leaving things on, I think, is dire. Like our microwave's got a timer and a green screen, but it only gets switched on when we're using it, and we don't need a clock in there. So switching things off it's probably the #1 thing you can do for saving energy, is switching it off. And that's so basic, but nobody really understands it, and a lot of us don't do it. Probably explains why my internet's so slow as well, because I switch it off sometimes and leave it away. But it's switching off is #1. Probably the next biggest thing you could do is when you boil the kettle is don't boil more than you need. In other words, fill up the cup or mug, tip it in the kettle, boil it, tip it back out again. And I was saying to somebody the other day, if you do that, and while you empty the kettle out, give it a quick rinse and give it a quick brush round, you'll find that it doesn't chalk up as well if you've got hard water. So it's extra tip from Tony there for free.
Interestingly enough, and I'll just comment on that and then do a plug for our we have a sponsor for our series of events, which is Pucker Herbs.
Yeah.
And Pucker Herbs did a carbon audit on their way to reaching net zero.
Yeah.
From their crop until their cup. So they did it right the way through their entire sort of value chain. And then they were totally shocked when they found that 49% of their carbon footprint was in people boiling the kettle to make a cup of tea in the entire business. And that half of that was wasted because on average, people were boiling twice as much water as they needed, using twice as much energy.
Yeah, that's it.
So they combined with an NGO effectively after that to run a campaign to try and get us to boil the right amount in our kettles.
Brilliant. I love it. Thank you. I like that story. That's a great story.
It's a pleasure. I thought you might be interested. So, okay, right. A question from Brian McGavin. Floor insulation is not something that gets much attention. People think warm air rises. Can you say more on this?
Yes, floor insulation is important. And as I explained, going through, it used to be thought of as 15% went out through the floor. And because we've insulated houses better, wall, ceiling insulation, better windows, bit of draft proofing, more goes out through the floor. And it's especially true if you've got wooden floorboards that are ventilated underneath. If you think about it now, between you and the outside world going downwards is maybe a carpet and a 20mm floorboard. And in my view, insulation needs to be 200mm or 300mm thick. And so under the floor, the minimum I'd really accept would be minimum I'd accept maybe 100mm. Sorry, it's my phone's going off and I don't know how to shut it up. So bad, isn't it? So I really like floor insulation. I've actually put in grants for filling floor voids with polystyrene beads. It's a radical solution, but I know somebody in Ireland who's filled 12 floor voids with polystyrene beads between 5 and 10 years ago. Not a single problem with any of them. And when you take a floorboard up, you just see polystyrene beads. And phenomenal, it makes the place so warm. And there are concerns about that used to be ventilated. Now you've blocked it up, so you breach of building regulations. But my view is that if there's not a void, it doesn't need to be ventilated. So we're into semantic question now. If you fill your floor void with not necessarily polystyrene beads, but something similar, then are you breaching building regulations? Because if it was a concrete floor, you can put polystyrene underneath it. And so I'm very much in favour of floor insulation. And the thing about wooden floorboards is that they leak air between the floorboards, underneath the edge of the floor, up underneath the skirting, sometimes behind the skirting and out the top of the skirting in older houses. And this one's even worse. They sometimes leak air up the back of the door lining, which is the door frame in your way of thinking. And then it comes out above the architrave at the head, out through the lock hole where the latch goes in, out behind the architrave up the sides, depending whether it's sealed in or not. And that not necessarily just on outside walls, but on internal walls as well. So doing floor insulation has a knock-on effect with draft proofing. So I'm all in favour of floor insulation. If you don't like the idea of filling the void full of polystyrene beads, then stick in 100 or 200mm of insulation underneath the floor. Cheapest form is fiberglass pushed up in between if you can get under it. Take it up, strawberry net, drop fiberglass down in between the joists. I actually like people to insulate under the joists as well as between, but doing any of those things would be magnificent and very good for comfort, increasing comfort. Yes, warm air does rise, but if it's cold around your feet, then you feel cold. And if you can up the temperature of the floor, then you radiate less heat downwards and you feel more comfortable.
Great, thank you. Right, different topic. I had a couple of comments on conservatories.
Yeah.
All conservatories are bad if they're used to grow food, grapes, cucumbers, etc., and unheated. They provide an extra layer of insulation on the part of the house they're attached to. And somewhat supplementary to that, I was thinking of a conservatory which doubles on purpose as a cold frame greenhouse. Is there any solution to it? What's your view?
I only have a problem with heated conservatories, but the problem is that a lot of people turn it into part of the house and heat it. And that's when I get the problem, and even worse, cooling it. If you've got air cooling in there, I think I love it. If you're growing vegetables in there and using it as a cold frame, then great. And yes, it does help insulate the house, although in summer it can help heat it up. It collects the sun and it can actually overheat a house. Having a conservatory, it's basically turning the back wall of the house into a kind of storage heater, and you don't want that in the summer. Obviously, you might want it in the winter, depending how well the wall is insulated. But I'm a bit radical, and I have been a bit provocative about conservatories, so I probably ought to apologise. But the point is, don't waste energy heating them.
What about a conservatory conversion kit that you can put on and off, a bit like a sweater? So you put it onto your conservatory in the winter and take it off when you come in the summer.
Yeah, that's great. I know people that do that, and it's a good idea. Yeah.
I mean, I'd actually never heard of it if you're just saying that. So is that something that they've done themselves, or is there a company doing it?
A suspended ceiling in his conservatory that's 100mm of polystyrene with a sheet of wood on the bottom of it, and it all just kind of slips and slides up there, and it makes it into almost a room in the winter, and in the summer he takes it out and turns it into a conservatory again. And I kind of take my hat off. I think he's done quite well. You can now get insulated roofs for conservatories. You can see it in the Telegraph or the Times. We'll put a new roof on your conservatory, you'll have a cheap, proper room. The problem still is that all the windows, too many windows, too much heat loss, and probably drafts and stuff going on as well.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, right. Now we've got a question from Johnny Payne. You mentioned about passing an airtightness test not being sufficiently airtight. Are these tests only relevant to new builds? How lenient are these construction standard tests? Do you feel there needs to be re-evaluation of these tests to a higher standard and that the pass mark's too low?
I've got a lot of problem with air tightness tests. There's something in the National House Building Council say robust details for building new homes. And one of the robust details is that when you put a skirting board on, you mastic between the skirting board and the floor to stop air leaking into the room. And so now I have a very big problem with doing that, because the air shouldn't even be behind that skirting board in the first place, because that behind that skirting board is already inside what I consider to be the heated envelope of the house. And so we've got a very big problem if you have to seal between the skirting board and the floor to stop air getting in. What can actually happen is that each room is airtight and all the rooms joined together are airtight, but wind is blowing around in between the ceiling of your lounge and your bedroom upstairs. Typically, every house in the country has this problem. Certainly every house with cavity walls, even if they're insulated, has this problem. And a friend of mine at Sheffield University used to say it's like living in a bungalow with no loft insulation and in a caravan upstairs because you've got no insulation under the floor. And those two things, it's what I call an in-house winter cooling system. And it is very, very bad. And your house can still pass an air tightness test for current building regulations and still have that draft going right through underneath the first floor void from side to side, front to back, cooling everything, coming out under the bath, in the airing cupboard. Lots of places it's a big problem. So we in the UK basically do not understand what air tightness means. Building regulations have said that you need to reach a certain standard of air tightness. I think it might be 3 air changes now at 50 pascals. And if you fail that, they might let you off at 5. When they build a house, they test 1 on an estate to try and make it pass. And it takes them a week of fiddling about with sealants and guns and foam and stuff to get it to pass. And then they assume all the rest are okay. There's bigger problems than that, which I don't know whether I really want to go into this, but it's called dot and dab plasterboard, where basically a builder doesn't like to do wet plastering. He wants to stick plasterboard on all the walls of blockwork houses. And so now he's supposed to put a continuous ribbon of adhesive right round every sheet of plasterboard. And when the guys come and do it, they just put dots and dabs on, stick it on. And unfortunately, outdoor air blows around behind the plasterboard, coming out under the skirting, through the sockets, into pipe boxes, all sorts of places. And it's quite a big problem. It's known about. We're supposed to parge coat the wall before we do the dot and dab dry lining. All sorts of things are supposed to happen, but they don't, I'm afraid. And many new houses that have been built between the 80s and now are very, very drafty. And effectively, I think people living in plasterboard tents when it's windy. When it's not windy, it's not such a problem, but it's quite often windy. And when it's very windy, it's very cold. And so the U values just disappear. It's called thermal bypass. The insulation is bypassed and heat is whipped away into outside air. So I hope you don't live in any of those houses, but check your sockets today. You can have a candle in front of it. If you wet the back of your hand with a flannel and hold it in front of a socket outlet, you might find there's a draft coming out of it. Talcum powder works if you spray some of that around and see if it blows around in the wind. So yes, I think the regulations are too slack. The air tightness target in Canada, they would laugh at us saying 3. They want to be 0.1 air changes an hour. So 3 is disastrous. It's similar to having a vent window open all the time. And if you get up to 5, it's like having a patio door open all the time. So that's the sort of measure of how unairtight we are.
Okay, right, thank you. Another question then from Bill Dowling. What is the EROEI of triple glazing, bearing in mind virtually nothing of a double glazed window is actually recycled? I think I need a new modern house built to the highest standard, says Bill. And where is all the money going to come from for all this upgrading and insulation on older properties? So two questions, one about the double glazing, triple glazing.
Yeah. I think it's a bit unfair to say nothing in the window will be recycled. I'm pretty certain that glass will always be recycled. You can always take second-hand glass, even double glazed units, to the glass shop, and he will take it in his bin and it will go back into the factory and into the process. They crush it up and put it through a machine that looks at it to see that it's really glass and what quality is and what it can be used for. But window glass is generally recycled back into making window glass, albeit frosted glass or something like that. So glass is good for recycling, and it can be recycled, and it very often is recycled. Plastic frames are another matter that I don't like plastic frames. I don't think it's a good framing material, but it's probably the cheapest, and it's certainly the volume product. So what was the second part of that question?
The second one was, where's all the money going to come from for all the upgrading and insulation for older properties?
That is a really, really good question. I'd love to know the answer. There's a very interesting scheme going on in Bulgaria where they borrowed 3 billion euros and they started doing citywide upgrading of properties, and they were doing it with a grant money, and the energy saving goes ploughed back into the fund to fund further renovation. So it's quite a nice model, and they seem to be rolling that program forward. I think it will run out of money eventually, but it's certainly rolling a lot further than it would without the energy input. So for me, the cost of doing it it's really worrying how much it costs to renovate a house. Like I've already mentioned, 30 and 50,000 for a small house. The energy savings take a long time to pay back in terms of turning it into money and then turning it into repaying the capital and stuff. With interest rates low, we're in a better position than we ever have been in the past for investing in renovation. I think Richie Sumak said £5 for everybody if you want to do improving your home. And unfortunately, it doesn't really scratch the surface. The whole scheme is probably undeliverable. I don't even think the government can cope with administering it, never mind people actually getting the vouchers and getting somebody who's registered. And it's even possible that the registered people are charging twice as much to do it than it would have cost in the first place. And so the scheme is kind of dead in the water because it's just as cheap to wait until after the scheme and get it done and spend your £5,000 to get the same work done that it would have cost with £5 grant costing 10 grand. So it's a little bit difficult. I would like to see massive renovations going. I think the energy performance certificates are kind of a nice way to start. Like you can't rent out a house with F and G, and that will soon be going to E, F and G, and then it will go to D, and then there's even talk about 2025 all rented out properties got to be C for an energy performance certificate. And that's kind of wheedling in. It then starts affecting the value of a property that's not well insulated. And so it's a very big problem. I'd love to have a good solution for it. And it's difficult. I wish people would do more DIY, make sure their own lofts are insulated and do the draft proofing. And then at least we've made 2 steps in the right direction. Possibly we've talked about floor insulation is possible on a DIY basis. So I've really not got an answer to that question, so I'm flanneling a bit, and it is expensive. 4-bedroom detached house is going to be 100,000 probably to renovate to an eco standard.
Right. Okay.
I could come in there, please, Tony. Sure. I see somebody's actually asked a question I'd like to ask. Ken Huggins, I have concrete floors. How can these be insulated? I have the same problem. I think a lot of people have. They may have done everything else, but I'm aware that that's where it's cold.
Yeah, so you can break the floor up, take it down and put insulation in underneath. Very expensive, very messy and very intrusive, but at point of sale or point of buying a new house or point of renovation, you can do it. The interesting one, which you might like to consider, is to do something which I call perimeter insulation. And so basically you dig a trench around the house down to foundation level, which is probably 1 metre down, and you put a sheet of polystyrene against the outside wall. And then what now happens is that the heat from the floor is trying to escape downwards, but it basically does a kind of a curved path and comes back up through the lawn or the path or the driveway. And if you can stop it doing that and force it further downwards, what happens is the ground under the house warms up slightly more than it would have been if it hadn't have got that perimeter insulation in place. And so effectively you finish up using the ground as a kind of insulated thermal mass that transfers heat much more slowly than it does now. So the floor starts to become a little bit warmer feeling. It's a little bit disruptive, but it can be done on the outside. And if I was doing it on my house, or if I was in your shoes, I would insulate up to damp-proof course with that polystyrene and have a little kind of sloping roof from damp-proof course going downwards, and it would almost then join up with the cavity wall insulation that I hope you've got as well. And so you're effectively cooling the underside of the house in warmer stuff than it would be without our perimeter insulation. Radical idea, but it can work. And it's certainly less disruptive than breaking up all the floors.
Okay, great, thank you. Margaret Beasley has asked, is there a way that one can measure the U value of one's own home? We have retro insulated, but have no idea of the U value.
It is possible to do a U value, and you can also get some little things that stick on the wall, which are heat flux meters. So you can measure the amount of heat going out through an aluminium foil patch stuck onto your wall. They're the sort of things they use in the Salford Energy House. You can look that up, Salford Energy House. It's a very good test bed for things. If I was wanting to work out the U value of the wall, I think I would just go back and do it by knowing what the concrete block is, or the thermalite block, or the timber frame, what the cavity is filled with, what the outside is filled with, what the internal plaster is, and then just do it as an elemental approach. You can find the U value of each one of those elements and add them up, and it's a sort of fairly simple mathematical calculation to give you the overall U value. And that's how I would advise calculating what U value you've got for walls, floor and ceilings in your house.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've had quite a bit of a debate on bits and pieces we should turn off in our house. Somebody's actually mentioned they have a special plug which recognizes when their PC is switched off and then switches off the extension lead that powers any accessories.
I love that one. They were given away free by energy companies a few years ago. Really, really good. And it doesn't need you to think about it either. That's what I really like about that one. So yeah, well done for having that. And PCs fire up so quick now, there's not really an excuse for not switching them off. Like they just fire up in seconds, whereas in the old days it used to take a few minutes.
Air conditioning installation in schools, question from Brian McGavin. So air conditioning installation in schools, offices and homes has become very prevalent, but we rarely need this in the UK. Should there be legislation to curb this?
Yes, I agree. I hate air cooling. It's very energy expensive and it's a wasteful. Good design. You should not need to use air cooling. Maybe in a computer server room or something you might, but even then I suspect that you could probably just have a powerful fan blowing outdoor air in and it would be cool enough without having to run an electrical device to cool the air. So I think I agree with you, let's not do it. There are places that have to have air conditioning, and I sometimes visit Hong Kong, which I'm a bit ashamed of, but I go there and the most expensive designer shops have their air conditioning on at 18 degrees, and it's sometimes like 30 degrees outside. And so you literally freeze to death going in their shop. But it's a kind of status symbol, people love it. And if I was in charge, I would say you're not allowed to run that air conditioning at less than 23 degrees. I'll just say that is just what it is. And heating, I would say something similar, like you're not allowed to run the heating more than 21 degrees. Some people might say 21 and a half or 22, but I think we will eventually get to the place where we have legislation for how warm or how cool you can run your home. And I wish that people would shade windows, stop the sun coming in the summer, rather than run air cooling units. So I'm very much with you on that. It's a kind of politically sensitive thing. A lot of offices like to have air conditioning, air cooling, and it's very rare that it is warmer outside than it is in the offices, so you can always pump air through. And so I'm for using natural or forced ventilation to keep places cool. Maybe a few days a year we have very hot outside temperatures, 30 degrees, but it's very few and far between.
I also happened to listen to a program the other day where they were saying that actually the air conditioning industry is based on a norm, and the norm is somebody in an office environment wearing a Western suit like I'm wearing now, which is clearly irrelevant in 90% or more of the circumstances in which people use air conditioning.
I can tell you the worst one of all. I went into some offices for sustainability surveys in Reading, and I went round, they had the air conditioning on, the air cooling on, because it was a very hot summer's day. But in 2 of the offices, they had people with fan heaters on because they were too cold. Yeah. And I couldn't believe it. I pinged them for health and safety and for sustainability. I said, you can't let staff bring a fan heater in because it's too dangerous. It might set somebody's coat on fire or something like that. It's just, and I said, sustainability wise, that is a complete no-no. You're paying probably double and plus more for the energy to do heating and cooling in the same space. Nuts.
Yeah. Okay, probably the last question now, which is quite an interesting one actually, from Viviana Vincent. What is your opinion on green living walls as a means of insulation and cooling for summer?
Right, really interesting. I do talk about this one before. I love green roofs. I've built a few green roofs. Green walls are a little bit more difficult. In terms of insulation, they are very, very minimal. They do have an insulating effect. Having ivy growing over your house will insulate the wall a bit better. And the main effect is something called wind wash, and it's the surface layer of air on the outside of the bricks or the render or boarding or whatever you've got in your house actually has quite a high insulating effect. And if you can stop it getting blown away by wind by putting it behind something like plants or ivy, then that does it. But I've already said, if you start looking up the U values and the extra bit of U value you get from having a green wall, it's pretty insignificant compared with what I would like you to have as 200 millimeters of insulation. It's probably equivalent to 1 or 2 millimeters of insulation. And so for me, it's insufficient insulation. And incidentally, while we're talking about insufficient insulation, a cavity wall is probably 50 millimeters thick for the 70s and 80s, went up to maybe 65 in the 90s and 100 now. If you fill that with insulation, I still feel that 100 millimeters of insulation is insufficient, and 50 millimeters of insulation in your wall is definitely insufficient sustainability wise going towards the future. So 1 and 2 millimeters for green wall, I'm afraid they do research on it and write papers about it, but for me it's not sufficient. Although if you want me to flip the coin over to the other side, every little counts. So it is valuable to have that extra bit of insulation. It's just, for me, not valuable enough. Good question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think we're now reached time, a little tiny bit over time. Yeah. Tony, that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much. Brilliant. We have to just let everybody know we've got one more talk today on Energy Day. So we've got our electric vehicles talk starting in an hour. So that's at 4 o'clock.
I drive an electric vehicle all the time. I've been doing one for 11 years come March next year. So it's pretty good. Probably the first in Reading. I've got one passing comment for you. I might have made it already. The oil and the gas. I think we should use that for pharmaceuticals or making insulation, not burning in our homes. But that's been great. Lovely to have come. I think I'm not going to manage to do the electric vehicles one, but I do love driving electric vehicle. It is really good fun, and it's my motoring costs are going to be £1,200 a year for 10 years, including insurance, fuel, capital value. So, and that's driving a new car for 11 years. Not bad cost.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Lovely.
Thank you, Tony. So everybody, look forward to seeing you at the